This is a really fun thing about tonight's presentation. This is special to us. So, we put out on our calendar who's going to be speaking, what the subject will be in our calendar and our rented. And we got this letter on in April. This is from William or Bill H. Sutter. And this is, or Suter, sorry. And so this is, to whom it may concern, in 1952. He is now 102 years old. In 1952, Simpson's Garden Town Nursery on Foothill Boulevard had a huge fire, and I was the insurance claims adjuster assigned to handle his claim. The nursery included an aviary, and Mr. Simpson had opened the doors to let the birds fly free. This included a number of parrots, and they liked the environment, stayed, and, of course, reproduced. So this is a beautiful piece of information for us and for our speaker. And also, as an extra added bonus, we have Mr. Suter and his family on the Zoom. They're Zooming in tonight and listening. So thank you, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you sending us this letter, Bill. And I know our speaker does as well, because we just told her right before, and she was really pumped to hear it. So thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate it. Yes. Okay. So after that slide, we can now hear the actual presentation itself. So this is tonight's speaker, the Parrots of Southern California, our favorite chatty neighbors. With our speaker, please help welcome Brenda Ramirez.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for all being here today. All right. So to give a little background on what I do at the Moore Laboratory of Zoology to kick off our presentation today, it was established in 1951 after Robert T. Moore donated his personal collection to Occidental College. And so this collection was created by collecting birds, a lot from Mexico, trading, selling, buying, etc. And so in our collection, we have around 2,200 bird species and around 65,000 individual birds. Along with all of these birds, we also have mammals, skulls, eggs, as you can see in this photo on the right. That's just a few of the eggs in our collection. And we also have the world's largest collection of Mexican endemic birds with around 50,000. And so in the bottom photo, you can see there are 3 museum specimens, and you can see my coworker Alana is holding one of their museum tags. And so each of the specimen has a tag. If they were collected originally in Mexico by Chester Lamb, who was hired by Robert T. Moore, then they'll have information from the date, the time, the location, who collected it, etc. And then now, as we update our collection and our database, we have our own Moore Lab tag that goes on them, as well as new birds that are processed and put into our collection. And so we're not actively collecting birds at the moment, but whenever we do get a window strike bird or one that got hit by a car, or from our partner SoCal Parrot, a parrot didn't make it after getting injured, then they get taken to our collection and then introduced into our museum collection in that way. And so I specifically work under the Free Flying Los Angeles Parrot Project, or FLAPP for short, because who doesn't love a good bird pun? And we collaborate with the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, as well as the Parrot Rescue SoCal Parrot, which is based within San Diego. And so the main objectives for our project are to really understand the ecological and genomic changes that these parrots have experienced since being introduced to Southern California. We also want to assess how Southern California differs from their native ranges, since they're found in very different environments than urban Los Angeles, which we have here. So that brings us to a huge question of how did the parrots get here? And so now that we have the confirmed story, which is incredible, I was so excited to hear about that email. So thank you so much for sharing it. But one of the very popular stories that I hear a lot from events like these are there was a pet shop fire in the 1950s. And so the owner of the pet shop heroically ran inside and let all of the birds and other animals go. And so a lot of people believe this is 100% how the parrots got here, how they were introduced into the wild, and that is the source of them all. Another very popular story that I've heard is allegedly during the closure of Busch Gardens, there was an aviary net that fell, and so the parrots were released in that way. And so there's no way of knowing if that story is true, but we do have confirmation for the Simpsons fire now. But it's likely that all of these events contributed to why these parrots are here, with the largest contributing factor being the illegal pet trade. And so all of these parrots and parakeets are extremely popular pets. I'm sure you know someone or might have parrots yourself. And so this is the main reason as to why they were brought into Southern California and have been able to establish their populations here, either through accidental release, purposeful release, and heroic events such as saving them from a pet shop fire. And so that brings us to the question of how many parrot species actually exist in Southern California that we can see just kind of flying around. And so if we look at iNaturalist within our project, we have the most popular parrot seen and most commonly photographed is the first one, the red-crowned parrot, with almost 3,000 observations alone, as well as other common parrots that you might see with them, including mitered parakeets, the lilac-crowned parrot, or even the yellow-headed parrot. Slightly less common, we can see other parrots and parakeets here. A lot of these are very common pets. For example, there's budgies, cockatiels, lovebirds. And so as an example, we had budgies and cockatiels growing up. So very common pets. And then here we have parrots with slightly less observations with under 5, but these are still very charismatic species that we can all recognize, like macaws, other lovebirds. And then finally, we have a few very rare sightings of parrots that have only been seen once each. And so in total, there are 37 species that have been photographed in iNaturalist alone. And so this could be just a small number of parrots that have actually been seen compared to the number that's actually out there. And so it's really important to have this community science database where we can see exactly what species are around Southern California. And so for our talk tonight, we're going to be focusing on 2 parrot species, the first being the most common, the red-crowned parrot, or Amazona viridiginalis, and its sister species, the lilac-crowned parrot, or Amazona finchi. And so as I mentioned, these are very common within Southern California, and they typically will be found in flocks together. And so for a little background on their native ranges, on the western coast of Mexico in purple, we have the lilac-crowned parrot, and on the eastern side of Mexico, we have the red-crowned parrot. And you can see their native ranges highlighted in these maps. And so these parrots were brought to Southern California through the illegal pet trade, and now they're primarily found throughout Los Angeles and in the San Diego areas. To talk about their native habitats specifically, along the West Coast, the lilac-crowned parrots will prefer the tropical dry forest and coniferous forests at higher elevations, whereas the red-crowned parrots prefer the lowland, subdeciduous tropical forests. And so within their native ranges, these parrots never interact. They are separated by 2 mountain ranges in a desert, and so they have no chance of coexisting. However, since being introduced to Southern California, they're thriving, which is very important since they are endangered in their native ranges. And so here we have these flocks in very urbanized areas, as I'm sure you have all seen. And so within Los Angeles, they have taken advantage of all of the fruit trees that people love, and now they're found in these mixed species flocks. And so you can see over 1,000 parrots at a time at some of these roosting sites. And so that brings me to one of my favorite events that we have at the Moore Lab. It's called Follow the Flock, where we bring the public to the Temple City Parrot Roost. And so right as the sun starts to set, you see thousands of parrots flying from every direction and landing on this very busy street that's lined with trees. And so the trees fill up, they're extremely close, they are not bothered by a pretty large group of people and all of these busy cars. There was construction. They do not mind. And so I have 2 videos to kind of give you some of the magic that you feel when you're there. So it's just unbelievable, just the ruckus that they make as they're coming in. You might have heard my coworker Russell going, "Whoa!" I recommend, even if it's not with us, if you have time, visit this flock. So peak flock seasons are in the later fall or winter before they pair off into their breeding pairs. But incredible event. And so for our research questions, since we can't just go out and stare at parrots all day, we want to understand more about them and why they're here so successfully. And so our main questions are, number one, how can we create a robust data set so that we can study the different conditions these parrots prefer, especially since they're sister species from such different native ranges? Number two, how do we distinguish between these sister species? They look extremely similar, and so we want to be able to have a reliable data set that does, in fact, distinguish between the two of them. And number three, how do the environmental conditions of their native ranges, which are pretty different, compare to the even more different Southern California? And so to start on our first question about our robust data set, we turn to community science. And so, as I mentioned, we have our project on iNaturalist. And so every observation of a parrot or parakeet under the family Cetacity is automatically collected into our iNaturalist project, FLAPP. And so here, this allows us to get data from all over Southern California, and it involves people in science that's happening in their own neighborhoods. And so it's extremely crucial that people are involved and excited about the science that's happening around them, especially since they get to hear these parrots on a regular basis. And so to show you what our iNaturalist project looks like, this is the main page. You can see we have an overview tab that has recent observations. We have over 8,000 observations to date, which is incredible. As I mentioned, we've seen 37 species of parrots, and we have over 2,000 observers. And so lots of people participate, and it's a really incredible resource to have. And so if you would like to participate, it's actually extremely easy. You can download the iNaturalist or the Seek app and create a free account. Once you do that, you would just hit the join button up at the top. And it's important that you trust FLAPP. And you can use the QR code to join our project as well. And so when you trust FLAPP, what that means is that we are allowed to see the specific locality information associated with your observations. Since these species are endangered, iNaturalist will automatically obscure the coordinates, which is extremely important for the safety of these parrots, since they are very popular pets that will get poached. And so if you trust us, then it allows us to see the specific location of these birds so that we can pull information from those locations. And so to participate, you would have to upload your photos. As an example, these are 3 photos that I took of one red-crowned parrot that was found at Oxy. And so to do this, because iNaturalist can be a little scary, you're sharing your personal observations online and you don't want to misidentify a species, right? I get a little shy sometimes when I get it wrong, but we're all learning. And so iNaturalist is really helpful with that because it gives you suggestions. And so it can identify it to genus level. They're pretty sure that it's in that genus, and then it'll give you suggestions based on common species within that area. And so sure enough, that top suggestion is a red-crowned parrot. And so as you can see on the left photo, we have the date, the time, the location, and then the geoprivacy of this observation. And so if you have your observation set to private, the public won't be able to see, but if you trust our project, then we'll be able to have that data. And so once your observation is posted on iNaturalist, it'll have your suggested identification. And if another person sees it and agrees with that identification, then your observation will become research grade, which is shown at the top by that green ribbon. And so having a research grade observation is extremely important because it helps us assure that the observation is identified correctly. I also want to point out that you can see a red EN, which emphasizes that these species are endangered. And then next to that, you see that pink exclamation point, which signifies that this species is introduced to that area. And so there's a ton of information that can be pulled from this, specifically the geotemporal data, which is what we use for our analysis. And so with that, we collect all the observations and that creates our data set. And I want to mention that when we do pull this data together, 2 researchers, myself and someone else, will go through each of the observations independently. And then if we have agreeing identifications, then we will count that as research grade to have a sure identification. And so some of you may be wondering, how can you tell which species is which? You look for key features. And so these are just some of the features that you can look for within these sister species to distinguish them. But I feel like they're the most straightforward and the easiest to use when you can see the parrots closer up. And so you would look at iris color, the bare skin, so the orbital around the eye and the cere above the beak. You would look at the forecrown color, and if there is scalloping on the breast feathers. And so to begin on the lilac-crowned parrot, if we zoom in on these facial features, we can see that it has a dark red or more orange iris. It has a dark gray orbital, so it has that darker skin patch around the eye. It has a dark gray cere, so it has that darker nostril coloration above the beak, and it has that maroon forecrown. And it's hard to tell from this angle, but these lilac-crowned parrots also have the scalloping on their breast feathers. And so basically that means there's a dark outline on the edges of the feathers. For the red-crowned parrot, if we zoom in on the facial features, we can see they have a yellow iris. They have a white orbital around their eye. They have the white skin coloration above the beak, and they have a bright cherry red forecrown. And so when you're zoomed in like this, it seems almost simple to distinguish these parrots. But of course, typically they're flying overhead or they're farther up in a tree canopy, so it's very hard to distinguish, but these are the easier ways to tell. And so I like to say that the lilac-crowned parrot has a smoky eye, and so it's ready for a night on the town because it does have these darker features around the face. And so when we're trying to compare the conditions of their native ranges to their introduced range, we have observations from Southern California through our community science project. What about Mexico? And so we gather information using eBird since these species do not coexist. And so having just observations rather than photos is fine, since there is a less likely chance of a misidentification since they're not found together. And so some key differences between eBird and iNaturalist. eBird is semi-structured, and so it collects data on date and time, location, duration, the distance someone traveled while birding, if it was a complete checklist or not. So if all of the birds that were seen or heard were recorded in their checklist, and media is only optional, whereas iNaturalist is more unstructured and only collects data on date and time, location, and you do need to have that picture. And so for Southern California, we don't use eBird since it's very likely that there is misidentifications, and without a photo, there's no way to confirm if not. And so that's why we use iNaturalist for Southern California, but eBird for Mexico. And so in order to make our data as less biased as possible, we do some data filtering and processing. And so we removed observations that were outside of their native ranges. For example, sometimes some points or observations were just slightly out of range, closer to the middle. And so we figured better not to risk it. We can just remove those and stick to the ones that are in the specific range that's highlighted. We also followed established best practices to remove any bias associated with the community science data. And then, as I mentioned, since these sister species don't coexist in Mexico, we trusted that misidentification would be less likely in these areas. So for our final data set, we had 517 red-crowned parrots in Southern California and 372 lilac-crowned parrots. In Mexico, we had 748 red-crowned parrots and 5,786 lilac-crowned parrots. For our environmental analyses, we use different layers of geospatial environmental data. And so BioClim is 19 temperature and precipitation variables. This gave us information like annual precipitation, temperature of the coldest month, different environmental conditions like that. We also use the normalized difference vegetation index, or NDVI, which gave us information on vegetation greenness, how green and natural was the area. We also took the standard deviation of that metric, which gave us the greenness seasonality. So at which parts of the year was there more green and vegetation? We used MODIS to do percent tree cover, since these parrots do nest in trees and will land on trees and feed off of like fruits and nuts on trees. We also used terrestrial quickscat as a level and measure of urbanization. And we also included elevation, since we do know that the lilac-crowned parrots typically prefer higher elevations in their native ranges. And so in order to get the full story of the conditions these parrots prefer, we also used buffers and background data. And so buffers were created to sample the surrounding environmental conditions of where the parrots are found. So we don't want just the information of the observation, we want the surrounding area as well, since we know parrots don't just sit still. And it's also important to use the overall niche or environmental conditions to assess the true differences between the introduced range and the native ranges. So to give you kind of an idea of what that looks like, we have the presence points from Southern California, as well as their native ranges, and then the buffers in green around them. And so that's kind of the environmental area that we pulled data from to compare. And so our presence locations are where the parrots were found, and then the background data is the surrounding area, so the green buffer as a whole. And so the way that I like to explain how we extract environmental conditions is think of it as like a pinpoint at one of these observations or one of these presence points. From that point, we pull each of the environmental layers, the value of each layer from that point, and then that's what we can compare for both of the ranges. And so you can see there's a stack of different layers. So think of it as like annual precipitation, urbanization, tree cover, elevation, things like that. And then you can just pull that data from where that parrot is found, as well as the overall surrounding environment. And so when we're comparing Amazona niches, we used a few different analyses, which I will explain one at a time. The first is a principal component analysis, or PCA. Essentially, these plots show the variation within our data, and points that are more similar are grouped together. And so this is based on the environmental data. So for example, on our x-axis, we have the variables that explain the most variation, and so the biggest differences between our ranges. And so here we have temperature, greenness, precipitation, and tree cover. And so then that gives us insight into these are the main differences between our ranges. We also used univariate box plots between species at both of the regions. And so this is to get a closer look at each of the individual variables. And so as an example, we have species 1 in red, species 2 in purple. And so we can see the range of where the parrots, in this case, are found within these conditions. And then we finally used reciprocal species distribution models. Essentially, we took the native conditions in Mexico that are suitable, since we know that these parrots exist there, and then we projected those suitable conditions to Southern California to see if they matched. And so to read these, the warmer colors represent high suitability, and the cooler colors represent low suitability. And so that's a little sneak peek into how suitable Southern California is for these parrots. So to begin with our principal component analysis, we have the purple circle on the top representing the lilac-crowned range in western Mexico. And then we have the red circle right underneath it representing the red-crowned range in eastern Mexico. And so as I mentioned, we have temperature, greenness, precipitation, and tree cover. These are the environmental conditions that differed the most between these two ranges. And so what's super important to note here is that these environmental conditions do not overlap. We see that they're close, but they're different. And so that's the key takeaway from this. They are divergent niches, and so divergent environmental conditions. And so if we add on to this, the Southern California presence points, we can see that there's complete overlap, which makes sense since they coexist in the same ecological environment. And so it's also important to note that they do not overlap with the native ranges, and so they are not very similar. When we add in the environmental surrounding area, now we can see we have this darker purple circle engulfing the lighter observations that we saw earlier, and we have a darker red circle surrounding the red-crowned parrots that we saw earlier, as well as a green circle surrounding the introduced species now. And so here we can see that there is slight overlap between the environmental surrounding areas even though there is an overlap between where the parrots have actually been found. And so although it's not extremely likely, we know that it is possible for these parrots to coexist in one place, since they have that overlap within each of the circles of the surrounding environmental conditions. And so if we look closely at the top variables that contribute the most to the variation, we have annual mean temperature on the left, we have native population first, followed by the introduced population on the right. We have red representing red-crowned parrots and the purple representing lilac-crowned parrots. If we look at annual mean temperature, we can see that they do have similar conditions where they are found, since we can see that the colored portions of these plots do line up with one another. The gray circles represent outliers, so other parrots that were kind of at more extreme conditions. And so we can see that they are very different conditions between the native and the introduced range for both annual mean temperature as well as vegetation greenness, and there is no overlap. For precipitation seasonality, we can see there's a pretty big difference between the native red-crowned and native lilac-crowned populations, but again, similar in Southern California since they do coexist here. And it is interesting to note that within elevation, we can see the lilac-crowned parrots can be found way higher than the red-crowned in their native range and in Southern California. But what's interesting is that you don't see lilac-crowned parrots at these high elevations. Although it's available with the different mountain ranges around us in Southern California, they prefer to stay pretty low elevations, which we thought was pretty interesting. And so when we look at our reciprocal species distribution models for the red-crowned parrot, here we have a zoomed in map of eastern Mexico, and you can see the red areas are where the red-crowned parrots are typically found, which is a highly suitable area. And then we have that surrounding buffer or environmental conditions to get the full picture of what the environmental conditions are like in eastern Mexico. And so if we take this habitat suitability model and transfer it to Los Angeles or Southern California to see if there's any areas that are similar, we see very low suitable habitat predicted. But the low habitat that is predicted is where they're found now. And so we can see that the LA area and the San Diego areas do have some predicted suitable habitat, which it kind of backs up what our principal component analysis from the first slide was showing. And that's that although the observations of these parrots don't happen in similar environmental conditions, there is overlap in the overall environmental conditions where they're found. And so although they're not technically in super suitable habitat here in Southern California, they've been able to still establish and create these very successful populations. If we look at the lilac-crowned parrot, we can see the western side of Mexico with the suitable habitat and the surrounding buffer. Again, if we project that to Southern California, there's very low predicted habitat suitability, just that small pocket in LA. And so although conditions don't seem like they would be ideal for these lilac-crowned parrots, they were able to still establish their populations here. And so that brings us to the question of, how have these parrots been so successful? What specifically about Southern California appeals to them? And so a big thing is food availability. As I mentioned, there are a lot of introduced trees that are here with fruits, there's nuts, etc. And so they have plenty of food available. And a very big thing is that the parrots kind of entered an open niche within Southern California. The native species were not using a lot of these resources. They were not interested in the introduced trees or exotic fruits. And so they had less competition and were able to take advantage of that open resource. Another would be propagule pressure. And so that is essentially the continuous introduction of these species. So pet shop fires, potential nets falling, people accidentally releasing their birds, or maybe even on purpose. And so these constant introductions of parrots also helped with their establishment into Southern California. Another possibility could be ecological release. So essentially, when they were taken out of their native range in Mexico, it could have taken them away from specific predators. It could have taken them away from the land urbanization that was happening, which is one of the main reasons why they're endangered in Mexico. And so it just released all of those pressures that they may had had in their native ranges and allowed them to establish and grow here. And then the last thing I want to mention is there's human-made and natural cavity nests throughout Southern California. And so having more nests available was also probably part of why they were so successful in Southern California. And so in conclusion, community science is an extremely important tool for our research and to really understand which parrots are in Southern California. I also want to point out that because these parrots now interact, they have the opportunity to hybridize. And so the way that you would be able to distinguish hybrids, which you may guess, is they would have mixed features. And so this very fun hybrid that our coworker took a photo of, if we zoom in, we can see it has that lighter orange and yellow iris. It has that white orbital around the eye, but a dark gray nostril above the beak. And so that is our first clue as to being mixed features. And then they have that cherry red foreground, but it does look a little bit darker than I would say the other red-crowned parrots have. And so being able to see these parrots close up is essential for being able to distinguish which species it is. And so there is hybridization happening, which we can see from some of the observations on iNaturalist, which I feel like if we didn't have these community science observations, it would have taken us much longer to be able to realize that this was happening. And so if you're interested in learning more or about the specifics about our research, since this was kind of an overview, you can check out our recent publication, which is in Diversity and Distributions. And so that was published in February. And so for future directions of the project, we really want to dig into the hybridization rates and the dynamics of these interspecies pairs. How common is it? Are these parrots do they have reproductive barriers between the species? Can they hybridize successfully? Is it just between the sister species? Or since these flocks have mixed species with others, at least 7 sometimes, is it happening between all of the species or just a few? We want to understand why the red-crowned parrot has been able to establish in other parts of the US. So for example, there's populations in Texas, Florida, Hawaii, Puerto Rico. And so we want to know, how are these ranges different to their Mexican ranges? How is it different to Southern California? And then we also want to understand how other non-native parrots have been taking advantage of the environmental conditions, and is there competition between these species? And then finally, we are actively working to compare the genetics of older museum specimen with present-day samples to understand how these parrots have evolved over time and how far the hybridization goes in the flocks that exist today. And so that is the end of my presentation. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you for listening. Yes.
With the iNaturalist project,
Mm-hmm.
you have to join the project, or do you guys pull out any observations?
So we'll pull any observation, but it's important to join so that we can get trusted observations. So essentially we can get your locality data. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, absolutely. So the question was, do you need to join FLAPP on iNaturalist, or are the observations collected automatically? And so I think it's better if you join so that we can get all of the information we can from each of the observations. Yes.
Your research have any possibilities of using some of these introduced species to help the populations back in Mexico get robust with a one-way ticket to California?
So the question was if our research has any implications on reintroducing some of these parrots into their native ranges, or is it a one-way ticket to California? And so as of now, we haven't been aiming toward that, but definitely there are possibilities of that. Since we have genetic samples of these species, we want to make sure that if any reintroductions happen, that it's a pure species and not any hybridized, because then it wouldn't be the same genetic material, and then it would just be introducing something new into that environment. But potentially, yes. Yeah.
So numbers of the lilac-crowned parrots versus the red-crowned parrots in their native ranges,
Mhm.
and also the size of the ranges is so different, like the lilac-crowned, there seems to be so many more, and so bigger
Right.
area that they inhabit. But then when you look at the populations here, the ratio is very different. And I wondered if that had to do with the habitat suitability, or if the red-crowned parrot is just a more popular pet, or.
That's a great question. Yeah, so the question was, in the native ranges, the lilac crown range is much larger and they are found in a lot higher numbers. But here in Southern California, they're not typically as common. And so the question is kind of, why is the red crowned parrot more prominent? And so it could be the habitat suitability. As we saw with our reciprocal species distribution models, there was less suitable habitat for the lilac crowned parrot. Red-crowned parrots could potentially just be more popular and could have been released at higher quantities, but we'd have to dig into that a little bit more to get a for sure answer. But that is a very good question. Yes.
I saw that there were 37 species of parrots.
Mhm.
And I was in my backyard and this squadron of parrots came over, tremendous noise, put Merlin on, and it said
Yes.
possible, or at least had a red dot on it, red mask.
Yes. Mhm.
Actually possible?
Yes. So we do have quite a few red masked parakeets, but it's very hard to distinguish them from the mitered parakeet because they look very similar. But if we look here, we have mitered with a lot more observations, and then we have the red masked. Here's a bigger view with 565, with 963 for the mitered parakeet. But yes, it is possible to see red masked. Yes.
So by ignoring Ebert data, you're throwing away a lot of valuable. There are thousands of people who use Ebert in this area. It's the most heavily Ebert part of the continent. And a lot of people upload photos.
Yes.
Of parrots in this area. I would encourage you to use these or the data set.
Yeah.
In addition, you're ignoring sound, at least the parents can say about some of these species can be identified by sound.
Yes. So the
And that could help you establish where some are. Maybe I'm not sure if you're interested, but Andy parrots, for example, are really easy to identify by sound. And it's quite easy to figure out where they are without a photo. Just by pointing. Yeah. And people are doing it using things like Parrot and other approaches to do that. Yes. And an increasing number of reports going into it. So I would encourage you to expand your horizons and utilize it. Yeah. You're also getting a somewhat biased sample because you're not doing that. The most experienced birders in this area generally don't find that.
Right. And we are aware. So the point was made that eBird is very highly used and that we're missing a lot of data since we're not using eBird observations. And so a lot of them do have photos that we can use for our data set. In general, we stuck with iNaturalist because we had our established project. We could connect with the public in that way. It's more user friendly. A lot of people that we interact with are students that are K through 12. And so it's just a more user-friendly, inclusive app, but I fully agree. I think eBird is an incredible tool. I use it myself. By sound, it is very tricky with the red-crowned and lilac-crowned parrots. I wouldn't be confident myself trying to distinguish them by sound. But I agree with you. I think it could definitely be possible to someone that has a more experienced ear. And we haven't done any research on the Nande parakeets yet, but I'm hopeful that we can expand our project to include a lot of the other introduced parrots and parakeets within Southern California. But you definitely have a very good point where we do, we are missing a lot of the data that's out there with eBird.
So right now, observations.
I believe some of them did, yes. Off the top of my head, I could not tell you. We looked through. Late in the day, it was common for Amazon parrots flying up and down again. Okay. You're right, they're difficult to distinguish wildlife. I couldn't tell you which one. Yes. Yes.
You look at eBird, you'll see quite a few records there. Some of us who are in this room.
Yeah.
So some of the parrots are going up into the mountains, so elevations of over 3,000 feet.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Do you know if there's any observations with photos?
Photos, I think there probably are some, but they're
Okay.
good. But they're flying over today.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry for the people on Zoom. He made a comment about how parrots have been observed in higher elevations in Southern California, and that some of these observations are seen on eBird. And so it's important to think about those things too. But very good to know. Thank you for sharing. Yes.
I had a question about, when they were first established in the fifties,
Mhm.
probably, the two areas. How big were these flocks? Because, was interbreeding a problem at that time? Because would this affect their health or anything like that? Because I know, also, due to the peacock explosion, and it was supposed to be a very small amount,
Mhm.
it affected some of theirs, but, had this affected, or did they have a lot of, migrating, I mean, birds that were from, as you said, people that brought them as pets and threw them out, stuff like that, that they bred with these, and made it a lot better? What was your findings or anything?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was, early on when these parrots were introduced, was there interbreeding there? Did it affect their health in general? So as far as I know, I don't believe it has affected their health, especially since they have these huge populations. And so they seem to be thriving. I don't think that being introduced to pets or kind of other parrots that were kept in captivity, I don't believe that it has negatively affected them. But that is a good question. Yes.
I have two questions. The first one is quick. I was surprised to see so many observations of burrowing parakeets on here. I don't even know where they are in Southern California. Where are they?
So the question was, where are the burrowing parakeets in Southern California? And so with those in particular, there is a flock in San Diego. And so I've been to see them myself. I haven't looked through those specific observations, but I have a hunch that it's the same group that's found in a very residential area. When I went, the people that lived in that neighborhood had seeds out for them. And so they were pretty content.
That's San Gabriel or San Diego?
San Diego. Mhm.
If I can do another question.
Yeah.
When I saw your map of habitat suitability
Mhm.
in Southern California, I sort of got the impression of like natural confinement of the parrot population. I'm just wondering, is that over interpreting that map, or is that kind of a real thing? Another way to think about this is, are these parrots going to end up in Santa Barbara someday, or are there barriers that they don't want to go through of habitat?
That is a good question. And so the question is, with the suitable habitat maps, which were the species distribution models, we see kind of a barrier of where these parrots could potentially be found, or where the suitable habitat would be found. And so the question was, is this going to stop the parrots from potentially traveling to other parts of Southern California? As far as we know, it's not a definitive answer as to whether or not they can continue to expand their populations. I think it was this one. And so I don't believe that it would stop them fully, since we've seen these areas are technically not very suitable, but they're here. And so especially for the lilac-crowned parrot, we can see that they're supposed to exist in this very small pocket, maybe, since this is very low suitable habitat. So it's not likely that they should exist here. And so I don't believe that it would be kind of a barrier for them. They have the possibility of expanding out past this. Yes.
The project is Southern California, but I understand there are large populations of parrots in San Francisco.
Yes.
Are they also primarily red-crowned?
I don't believe so. I think they might be, yeah, they might be mitered or red-masked. Red-masked. Yeah. Yes.
So when you have the lilac-crowned and the red-crowned, mating essentially and hybridized, what are those guys called?
So as of right now, and I buried the lead, I'm glad no one caught it. Within the iNaturalist observations, they are just listed as, and I believe it's, they are listed as Lilac-crowned X red-crowned parrot. And so they're not a specific species yet. That would take a very long time for the genomics to get to that level, or the genetics to get to that level. But right now, they're just Amazona finchi X viridinalis. Yes.
The Janelle Ortiz's lab at Cal Poly Pomona is doing a lot of population studies. They're kind of parallel to what you're working on.
Yes.
Two labs collaborate.
We have not, but I actually did both my undergrad and my master's at Cal Poly Pomona, so I do know Dr. Ortiz. We have chatted very briefly. We're parrot pals, if you will, but we have not connected since I started working at Occidental College. But I have seen that they do some very amazing work with drones and observing the different populations around Southern California. Yeah, I would hope so. Yes.
In their natural range, do they do that flocking behavior as well, where in the winter, you know, when they're pairing up for mating, they split off, but then they regroup in the wintertime, they do the same thing, right?
Sorry, the question was, in their native ranges, do they also form these flocks? Yes, and so there's power in numbers and safety. And so if these trees also have food, that is a triple win for these birds. And so, yes, they will flock whenever they have the chance in the wintering months. Yes.
Yeah, so in your map of suitable, potentially suitable habitat
Mhm.
for red-crowned parrots,
Mhm.
there was an area that appeared to be comparable in suitability on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada, east of the Yosemite National Park. You want me to comment on that? It looks, it just went by, or that one.
Yes, 1 second, sorry. This one.
Yeah, up at the top, the panel on the right,
Mhm.
top center.
Yes. So the question, no. So the question is, in this predicted suitable habitat within Southern California, there is some predicted suitable habitat within the northern bit here near the Eastern Sierras. And so I was asked to comment on that. With this suitable habitat map, these values are extremely low. We can see that 0.2 is starting to turn a little bit green. So this area is technically supposed to not be suitable basically at all. And so although they are found in Southern California in our regions here, potentially the conditions are similar within that region further north, but that does not mean that the parrots are going to be found there. Yes.
What exactly does that correspond to, that patch?
I haven't looked into it specifically, but I do believe it is the Yosemite region. But again, it's the low suitability that compares between the two regions. And so it's not anything that proves that it's suitable habitat. So it's not like it's predicting that the parrots will be found there. It's just very low suitable habitat within those areas. Yes.
Any study or observation regarding the health of the birds? You know, don't these parrots live like 80 years, 90 years, whatever, you know, they've got a lot of old birds,
Right.
as well as young birds, but are they resisting disease? How, you know, has there been any study on the health of the flocks over the decades?
Yeah, so the question was if there's been any studies on the health of the flocks over the decades that they've been here. As far as I know, there has not been. I feel like a lot of the research that is happening with the parrots is specifically on population sizes, species composition within these flocks, not specifically the health. That is a very good question, especially since it's all of these different species now intermixing. And so that could bring up the question of exactly the avian bird flu and any other kind of illnesses they could pass, but not that I know of. Yes.
The location that you showed the videos.
Mm-hmm.
I know exactly. It is a very area that has a lot of cars.
Yes.
I mean, all the day.
Mm-hmm.
Yet they can live there.
Yes.
As she was saying, do they have any studies of that area that possibly being unhealthy for them? I mean, do they thrive? Obviously, they're thriving. But I'm just wondering in that area. So.
Yeah. So the question was, at the Temple City Roost, are there any studies that look into the health of those parrots, since the area is very popular with cars, people, very busy, and so that I know of, there aren't any studies looking at the health of that specific group. But it's important to know that they will spend the night there and then they'll disperse during the day. And so they're not there the entire day or throughout the entire year, but it is a good question. Is all of that car traffic exhaust going to affect them? The construction that was happening could potentially also have some negative effects on them. But as far as I've seen, I haven't seen any studies. And I think specifically because the populations have been thriving. And so people might not have seen the need for it, but I think it is an important thing to consider. Yes.
Well, what is the impact of predators on bird populations here in Southern California versus Mexico? I assume there's different predators in each of those two areas. I'm not sure what those predators would be, but is that an issue you could investigate?
Yeah, so the question was about predators in the native range versus the introduced range and kind of the impact that they have on the populations. As far as I know, I believe it would be the common predators here, like hawks trying to get the babies or eggs. In Mexico, I'm not fully sure what their top predators would be. What we do know is that it's land destruction, habitat destruction, and then the poaching that are the biggest things that are affecting their populations. And so I think predators are not something that are really affecting these populations either here or in Mexico? But that is a good question. Yes.
How do they differ, or like does what they eat here differ from what they eat in Mexico?
So the question was, is their diet different here versus in Mexico? Yes. So in Mexico, they have more of the native habitat and vegetation around them, whereas here you'll see a lot of observations of them eating like loquats, other non-native fruits, but they'll also eat nuts, seeds, etc. And so their diets do seem to be pretty different. And so that could be another point of research that we could look into if their diets have affected them in any way. All great questions. Yes.
So recently ago, they observed some habitual behavior in the Amazon change. Many of them moved to the coast for breeding season and then back to the east side of the county during fall and winter. Do you see the same type of movement in the LA during the season changes?
That was a good question. And so how are the populations moving with the seasonal changes? I would say yes. They are pretty loyal to their roosting sites, but when they do pair off for the breeding season, I think they are pretty loyal to their tree cavities as well. And so we try not to exclude or disclose any of the tree cavity locations just for their safety, but they are pretty loyal to those tree cavities. And so they will go back and forth throughout the seasons.
When is the best time to see the
Ooh, the best time would probably be around December. I feel like that's when it's at its peak. Oh, sorry. The best time to see the Temple City roost. Well, thank you for all of your questions. They were all so interesting.